The courtroom was silent until a small voice echoed through its marble halls. No one expected the boy with trembling hands and oversized shoes to speak. But when he did, the truth he carried shattered every assumption in the room. And changed lives forever. The grandeur of the Palais de Justice on Isle de la Cite never seemed more intimidating than it did that morning. Rain tapped against the tall windows, echoing faintly through the high-ceilinged courtroom as people settled into the wooden benches, murmurs low, glances sharp. The scent of old stone, paper, and worn leather filled the air. Amina Bako, a single mother and immigrant from Nigeria, sat handcuffed at the defense table, her eyes hollow, lips pressed into a hard line. She had worked tirelessly cleaning apartments in the 16th arrondissement for 5 years, surviving off minimum wage, raising her only child with unmatched discipline and grace. But today, she wasn't seen as a mother. She was seen as a criminal, accused of theft, of breaking into an employer's home and stealing euro 6,200 in jewelry. She looked up only once, to the courtroom entrance, as a small figure appeared. Hesitating for a second at the door, he wore a school uniform under an oversized coat, shoes slightly scuffed, and a backpack that seemed far too heavy for his age. Elijah Bako was only 10 years old, but there was a resolve in his eyes that unsettled even the guards. He walked past strangers, past judgmental eyes, toward the front of the courtroom. The bailiff frowned. "Sir, this is not a space for minors. Please step. I'm here for my mother," Elijah said, lifting a folded piece of paper. His voice was clear, unwavering. "I have the right to speak." Judge Claire Dervaux looked up from her notes, her glasses sliding to the tip of her nose. "Who is this child?" she asked, more to herself than anyone else. Amina gasped when she saw him, shaking her head. "No, Elijah, go home. You shouldn't be here." But Elijah stood his ground. "My name is Elijah Bako. I am 10 years old, and I'm here to be my mother's lawyer." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A lawyer chuckled from the back. Someone whispered, "What is this, a joke?" But Elijah didn't flinch. He stepped forward and laid his papers on the defense table. Judge Dervaux narrowed her eyes. "Young man, I hope you understand the gravity of this situation." "I do, Your Honor," Elijah said, voice slightly higher pitched now but still strong. "No one else will fight for her. The man she was assigned hasn't even spoken to her. But I have. I know her, and I can prove she didn't do it." From the prosecution table, Antoine Merlet smirked. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this circus cannot be permitted. This child may be courageous, but we're in a court of law." "Silence, Mr. Merlet," Dervaux snapped, then turned back to Elijah. "And how do you intend to do this, Mr. Bako?" He reached into his backpack and pulled out a spiral notebook, worn at the edges. "I've been writing everything down since the arrest, the dates, the times, the people who were there, even the text messages. I found some things my mother's boss didn't want anyone to see." Elijah walked to the center of the courtroom, every step echoing like a drumbeat. He opened his notebook to a page filled with childlike handwriting and sketches. "My mom worked at Madame Lickler's house for 2 years. That morning, she was told to come in earlier than usual at 5:30 a.m., but the alarm code she always used had been changed. She didn't break in. Someone let her in, probably Madame Lickler's son Luke, who was still there after his party the night before." Judge Dervaux sat forward, her expression changing subtly. Elijah continued, flipping to another page. "And the jewelry? It wasn't even reported missing until 3 days later. But Madame Lickler filed the police report the same afternoon she fired my mom, before she even looked for the bracelets. That doesn't make sense." The room was breathless now. "She fired my mom because Luke had a fight with his girlfriend that morning, and my mom heard it. She told me. Luke was screaming at her and calling her names I'm not allowed to say. Maybe she saw something. Maybe she was a witness. But she's not a thief. Amina sobbed into her hands. Elijah looked up at the judge, his voice trembling now. I don't know everything about the law, but I know my mom didn't do this. She prays every night and never takes what's not hers. Please, don't send her away. A stillness fell across the courtroom. Even the prosecutor said nothing. Judge Dervaux stared at the boy, then turned slowly toward the defense attorney, Jacques Lamont, who had remained slouched and uninterested all morning. Mr. Lamont, she said coolly, care to explain why this boy just presented more defense in 5 minutes than you have in 3 weeks? Jacques stuttered. I had trouble accessing the documents. No more, she interrupted. Her voice softened slightly as she looked again at Elijah. I will allow a recess. Young man, you will remain here. I would like to speak with you privately. As the court adjourned, people rose from their seats in silence, some whispering, others stunned. A journalist quietly exited the room, already typing into her phone. Elijah stood by his mother, gripping her wrist gently. You shouldn't have. Come, Amina whispered through tears. I had to, Mama, he replied. They weren't going to listen, not unless I made them. From the bench, Judge Dervaux wiped at her glasses. She did not speak, not yet, but there were tears in her eyes too. After court adjourned, the large oak doors of Salle des Assizes 3 slowly closed behind the departing crowd. Inside, the air felt thinner, as if something sacred had just been said and no one dared disturb it. Judge Claire Dervaux remained seated on the elevated bench, silent, her fingers resting lightly on the gavel. Elijah stood a few feet away, now alone in the middle of the courtroom floor, clutching his worn spiral notebook. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear anymore, but from the exhaustion of holding back everything a child his age should never have to carry. Elijah, Judge Dervaux said, her voice gentle but firm, come sit. The boy looked up, confused. Where? She smiled faintly and gestured toward the wide bench in front of her. Next to me. A bailiff raised an eyebrow. Never, in his 15 years serving the courts of Paris, had he seen a civilian let alone a child invited to sit next to a judge. But Elijah obeyed, stepping carefully up the side stairs to the judge's platform and taking the seat beside her, legs dangling off the edge. Do you understand what you've done here today? She asked, folding her hands. I don't know, Elijah admitted. I didn't want her to go to jail for something she didn't do. Nobody was listening. The judge nodded slowly. That was very brave and very clever. But the court doesn't usually allow children to speak, especially not in place of a lawyer. I didn't mean to break rules, Madame Judge, Elijah whispered. You didn't, she replied. Not really. You exposed something much more serious. She leaned back and took off her glasses. For a long moment, she looked past Elijah out the high, arched window toward the spire of Notre Dame in the distance. Her voice, when it returned, was lower. I've been a judge for nearly 30 years. I've heard liars and criminals say anything to walk free. But I've also seen good people buried under silence because they didn't have the words, or the power, or someone willing to speak for them. She turned to Elijah, meeting his gaze. You did more for your mother today than many trained lawyers ever would. Elijah bit his lip. Does that mean she's free? Judge Dervaux's face darkened slightly. Not yet. But you've opened a door I wasn't meant to see, and I intend to walk through it. She stood in motion for her clerk. I want full transcripts of the arrest, security footage from the apartment building, and a formal review of the defense counsel's conduct. The clerk scribbled notes rapidly, stunned at the intensity returning to the judge's voice. Also, she added, I want the son Luc Leclerc subpoenaed. He was never formally questioned, and that's a glaring omission. Elijah's eyes widened. You believe me? I believe enough to keep asking, she said. Meanwhile, in a hallway downstairs, Amina Bako sat on a bench in the custody holding area. She was shaking, unable to speak. The bailiff guarding her leaned against the wall, glancing occasionally at her with a mix of pity and curiosity. Then the doors opened, and Elijah stepped in, escorted by Judge Dervaux herself. "Mama," he said softly, running to her side. "Elijah." She held him tightly, burying her face in his shoulder. "I thought they'd punish you for what you did." Judge Dervaux stepped forward. "Madame Bako," she said calmly, "I cannot promise you a verdict, but I can promise you fairness. I have questions now, and that's the beginning of justice." Amina blinked back tears, stunned by the judge's presence in the holding room. Before the judge turned to leave, she paused. "You raised a remarkable son." And then she was gone. Later that evening, in her office lined with books and portraits of stoic French jurists, Judge Dervaux opened her email and found 3 messages, waiting from an investigative journalist who had been present in the courtroom. The woman had already published an online piece titled, "10-Year-Old Defends Mother in Paris Court, Exposes Legal Negligence and Racial Bias in Shocking Turn." Dervaux sighed. The world was watching now. The next hearing was only days away. But something in her gut had shifted. A question lingered louder than any gavel she'd ever slammed. What kind of system lets a child speak more truth than all the adults combined? 3 days later, the courtroom was full. Word of Elijah Bako's testimony had rippled far beyond the Palais de Justice. Reporters lined the halls with notepads and cameras. Students from nearby law faculties asked to attend. The story of a 10-year-old boy daring to defend his mother had become a quiet revolution in the city of courts and marble justice. But while the world watched, Elijah sat quietly on a bench outside the courtroom, swinging his legs, his spiral notebook held tightly in both hands. He had barely slept. For every word of praise he'd received from strangers, his mother was still in custody. And she was still being treated as guilty. Inside the courtroom, Judge Claire Dervaux reviewed the updated case files with a grim expression. She had spent the last 2 days poring over arrest records, internal memos, and witness statements, each one more troubling than the last. A pattern was emerging, and it stank. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood. Elijah sat at the defense table next to the newly appointed public interest advocate, Mater Solane Gravier, a sharp and determined young lawyer who had requested the court to temporarily assign her to oversee Amina Bako's defense and to recognize Elijah's research as supplemental testimony. Elijah leaned toward her. "Is Luke here?" Solane nodded. He tried to dodge the subpoena, but Judge Dervaux personally ordered an escort. "He's waiting outside." Elijah's eyes narrowed. Across the courtroom, Prosecutor Antoine Merlet looked unusually tense. He avoided eye contact with the judge. He knew what was coming. He had reviewed the same files and knew someone had tampered with early testimony. Judge Dervaux adjusted her robe and addressed the court. "This hearing is to review new evidence and testimony in the matter of Madame Amina Bako versus the Republic of France. Let it be noted that the defense has submitted informal but compelling investigatory notes gathered by Elijah Bako. I have found them to be coherent, chronological, and factually verifiable." She turned to the door. "Bring in Luc Leclerc." The tall, blond man who entered was barely 22, wearing a wrinkled designer coat and dark sunglasses he didn't remove. His posture oozed arrogance, but his eyes flicked nervously around the courtroom. "Young Mr. Leclerc," Judge Dervaux began, "you were present in the apartment the morning the alleged theft took place. Yet you were never interviewed. Why?" Luke swallowed. I was asleep. Security footage shows you entering the building at 4:53 a.m. with a woman not your mother. Madame Bako was seen entering at 5:22 a.m. Who opened the door for her?" Luke hesitated. I don't know. She didn't break the lock." There was no sign of forced entry. If she didn't open the door herself, someone did. Was it you? He remained silent. Judge Dervaux raised her eyebrow. Very well. Then allow the court to hear an audio recording extracted from Madame Leckler's home intercom system. Submitted. 2 days ago by the defense, the recording began to play. The courtroom fell silent. Luke, open the door. I don't have a key today. Yeah, it's open. Just don't say anything to my mom about last night, okay? The voice was unmistakably Lutz's. A gasp ran through the gallery. Luke stood frozen. Prosecutor Merlett looked visibly ill. He had known nothing about this, or had he chosen not to know? Dervaux's voice cut through the silence. So you opened the door, you lied to police, you failed to come forward, and your mother pressed charges on the basis of your silence. Luke stammered. She was just scared someone in the building had taken the jewelry. My mom said to blame the cleaner. It was just a misunderstanding. Amina, seated now at the side bench, covered her mouth in disbelief. Selene Graver rose. Your Honor, we request immediate dismissal of charges, a formal review of false testimony by Madame Leckler, and investigation into prosecutorial negligence. Judge Dervaux didn't even hesitate. Granted. Elijah exhaled, then turned to his mother, who was already weeping silently as the handcuffs were removed. She stood, shaking, as if her legs couldn't believe they were allowed to move again. Then she looked at Elijah. Her boy. Her voice broke. You saved me. Elijah ran into her arms, burying his face in her waist. I told you they had to listen, Mama. They had to. From the bench, Judge Dervaux gently tapped her gavel. The sound was soft this time, less a blow of judgment, more a sigh of relief. I will be filing a formal complaint against the prosecution, she added, and a petition to recognize the rights of minors to provide supporting material in cases where no other defense exists. As the courtroom emptied, Antoine Merlett remained in his chair, his career now under review. Amina and Elijah walked out together, the boy's small hand in hers. Outside, on the steps of the Palais de Justice, journalists surrounded them. But Elijah just smiled up at his mother and whispered, "Let's go home." For a few days, it seemed like all of Paris had found a new kind of hero. Elijah Baco's face appeared on every local tabloid and news program. Le Petit Avocat, the little lawyer they called him. Photos of the 10-year-old holding his spiral notebook next to his tearful mother on the steps of the Palais de Justice flooded social media. But once the headlines faded, the city returned to what it knew best, forgetting. Amina and Elijah were released, but they were far from free. Back in their cramped flat on Rue des Petits Heddles, the walls still smelled of dampness, and the window overlooked nothing but a rusted fire escape. The landlord, once polite, now barely acknowledged them. Amina's phone barely rang anymore. Her cleaning clients had either stopped replying or canceled her contracts outright. No one wanted to hire the woman who had been accused, even if she had been proven innocent. One morning, as Elijah prepared his breakfast, dry toast and a bit of honey, Amina stared blankly at a small piece of paper on the table. A court notice. The Leckler family had countersued for defamation, claiming that Elijah's statements damaged their honor and public image. They want us to be silent, Amina muttered, her voice low and bitter. They want to erase what you did. Elijah sat down beside her. But it's the truth. She nodded. And that's what scares them. The new hearing was scheduled at a small tribunal in the 19th arrondissement, known for processing civil claims without media attention. It was meant to be quiet, buried, and bureaucratic, the kind of place where justice was a signature, not a voice. Meanwhile, across the city in her chamber office, Judge Claire Dervaux reviewed the complaint filed against prosecutor Antoine Merlett. Internal investigators had confirmed misconduct, selective evidence omission, and failure to question a key witness. But Merlett had influential friends, and the disciplinary process had already stalled. Worse, Whispers had started swirling around her, accusing her of being too emotionally involved, of lowering the bench by letting a child speak she knew the city wanted to forget. That's how it survived itself, by washing over its cracks with white marble and silence. But she also knew something had changed. The day of the civil hearing arrived cold and gray. No cameras, no crowd. Just a dim-lit room with peeling paint. 3 judges and the cold echo of heels on a tile floor. The Leckler family arrived with 2 lawyers in tailored suits. Seated arrogantly like royalty being inconvenienced, Elijah and Amina arrived together, with Soline Gravier again by their side. She was pro bono now. Her firm had threatened to drop her if she took the case further. She stayed anyway. "I'm sorry we're here again," Soline whispered to Elijah before they walked in. "I'm not," he replied. "Let them be ashamed, not us." Inside, the Leckler lawyers wasted no time. Their argument was polished. Elijah Bacco, a minor, made statements without full understanding of consequence. "The family has suffered online harassment. Madame Bacco and her son have created a media circus at our client's expense." Soline responded calmly. "My client was wrongly accused of theft based on 0 physical evidence. Her son presented factual, recorded proof of truth. If their image was harmed, it was by their own actions." The presiding judge, older, indifferent, barely looked up. "The matter is delicate, but image is not truth. We'll render a written decision," and just like that, it was over. The room cleared, no gavel, no closure. A week passed. Then, 2, and finally, a letter arrived. Amina opened it slowly at the kitchen table. Elijah stood nearby, watching every tremble of her fingers. She read it once. Then again, they lost. The tribunal had ruled in their favor. Elijah's statements were legally protected as testimonial truth, presented in a court of law. No defamation had occurred. Still, there was no celebration. No reporters returned. No calls for interviews. Justice had happened quietly. And Paris preferred it that way. But in the corner of their small apartment, Elijah was already writing again. This time, a new notebook, its pages still crisp. "Mama," he said, "maybe one day I can be a real lawyer, a real one, like in the big buildings." Amina smiled through her tears, brushing his cheek. "You already are, my son. The kind they don't teach in schools." It was a quiet Sunday morning in Paris, the kind where the streets feel like whispers and the city breathes gently through the fog. In their modest apartment on Rue des Petits Heddles, Amina Bacco was doing laundry in the kitchen while Elijah sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching courtroom diagrams into his new notebook. The past few weeks had been calmer. There were no more hearings, no cameras, but also no phone calls. Amina still couldn't find steady work, and though the landlord hadn't evicted them, he had doubled the water deposit without explanation. But there was peace, and then came the letter. It was hand-delivered in a white envelope with a golden seal pressed into the flap. Amina thought it was a bill at first, until she noticed the embossed emblem of the Palais de l'Élysée, the official residence of the President of France. Her hands trembled. "Elijah, come here." He ran over and leaned in. Amina broke the seal. The letter read, "To Madame Amina Bacco and Monsieur Elijah Bacco, it is with great respect that I extend an invitation to you both to attend a private reception at the Palais de l'Élysée. Your recent experience has stirred a national conversation about justice, truth, and the voice of our youth. You are not forgotten. With esteem, Anne-Sophie Valwood, Chief Advisor to the President on Civic and Social Affairs." Elijah blinked. "Is this real?" Amina nodded slowly. "They know your name, baby. Even in the palace." The day of the visit, Elijah wore a navy blue jacket with shiny buttons, one of the few gifts they'd received from a stranger after the trial. Amina wrapped her head in a patterned scarf and wore her best shoes, worn but polished. The Palais The Lila Sea was something neither of them had ever imagined stepping inside. Golden gates, white stone, and a courtyard large enough to swallow 10 of their apartment blocks. Inside, the reception room was elegant but quiet. A handful of people were gathered: legal figures, human rights advocates, and a few students from prestigious Parisian schools. Elijah felt small at first. But then he saw her, Judge Claire Dervaux, standing near a marble fireplace, sipping coffee and speaking to a minister. When she saw Elijah, her entire face changed. She crossed the room and knelt slightly in front of him. "You didn't stop writing, did you?" she asked softly. Elijah pulled out his notebook and opened to a fresh page. At the top, he had written, "If no one speaks for us, I will." The judge stood and turned to one of the aides. "I'd like him to meet Madame Valois personally." Minutes later, Elijah and Amina were ushered through a long corridor and into a smaller private room, where a tall woman in a cream suit stood. Beside a desk scattered with newspaper clippings, his clippings, "Madame Bacco, Elijah," she smiled. "You are the reason we're re-examining how justice includes children. The president has authorized a civic education initiative inspired by your story, one that reminds every child in France that they have a voice and a right to be heard." Amina clutched Elijah's shoulder tightly. "We're just trying to live," she whispered. "And yet you've reminded us how to lead." Valois replied. She handed Elijah a letter, signed and stamped. "In honor of courage without armor and truth without fear, let the Republic know your name." Later that night, back in their apartment, Elijah taped the letter on the wall above his bed. Amina watched him in silence, then turned off the lamp. But Elijah whispered into the darkness, "Mama, yes? Can I become a judge one day? Like Madame Dervaux?" Amina's voice was soft but full of pride. "You already judge better than most of them, baby. All that's left is the robe." Spring in Paris was subtle, that year sunlight gently slipping through branches, the Seine glimmering like polished glass, and life continuing as if nothing had ever been shaken. But for Elijah and Amina Bacco, everything had changed. The city had moved on. But those who mattered had not forgotten. Elijah was now a student at Lycée Honor de Balzac, enrolled with the help of a civic education grant arranged by the president's office. It was one of the most academically rigorous schools in the city, and though he was younger than most of the students in his grade, he was already being called Le Futur Advocate, the future lawyer, by classmates and teachers alike. But there was one final matter unresolved. The disciplinary hearing against prosecutor Antoine Merlet had been delayed twice. Officials cited internal review, but everyone close to the case suspected what Elijah had learned too early in life: the system protects itself. Judge Claire Dervaux, now weeks away from retirement, had called for a public hearing. She demanded it be held at the very Palais de Justice where it all began, not in a hidden office, not behind closed doors. "I will not retire," she told a colleague, "until this court stops pretending the truth is inconvenient." On a Monday morning thick with tension, Elijah sat again inside the courtroom where it had all begun. Only this time, he wasn't the only voice speaking for the truth. Dozens had come: students, lawyers, journalists, and even other immigrants who had followed Amina's story. It wasn't a circus anymore. It was a reckoning. Merlet sat stiffly at the defense table, his silver-framed glasses slightly askew. His face had aged. He knew this wasn't just about one trial. It was about all the shortcuts, all the poor, brown, black, and voiceless people his office had buried for years. Judge Dervaux entered last. Her black robe flowed behind her like a shadow she intended to leave behind in Paris. She looked directly at Elijah before speaking. "This hearing is convened to determine whether prosecutor Antoine Merlet acted with gross negligence, selective prosecution, and moral failure in the case of Madame Amina Bacco." Merlet's lawyer stood, arrogant as ever. "Your Honor, this is unnecessary. The charges were dropped," the boy exaggerated. The matter was resolved, but Dervo didn't blink. The law does not exist to protect the powerful from embarrassment. It exists to protect the powerless from silence. Then she turned to Elijah. "Would you like to speak, Mr. Baco?" The room hushed. Elijah stood. He wore his school blazer, and his spiral notebook was now replaced by a stack of typed pages, his first official essay submitted to his school's law club. It was titled, "Truth Has No Age." "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said. Softly, "I'm here because someone like Prosecutor Merlett could have sent my mom to prison. Just to close a file. He didn't care who she was. He didn't even ask." He paused. "But I cared, because she's my whole world." Elijah's voice never cracked. "If the law doesn't care about people like her, then it's not justice, it's a machine. And I hope I never become part of that machine." For a moment, Judge Dervo said nothing. Her throat tightened. Then, with deliberate grace, she reached for her gavel for the last time in her career. "In the matter of misconduct, the court finds sufficient cause to recommend the disbarment of Prosecutor Antoine Merlett from all prosecutorial duties and for the case to be reviewed by the Ministry of Justice." She stood and let the record show. The justice system was humbled by a 10-year-old boy who refused to be quiet. That night, Elijah and Amina walked back home under golden street lamps. There were no reporters, no letters from the palace, no one clapping. Just mother and son, hands locked, eyes bright, hearts full. "Mama," Elijah whispered, "do you think this is over?" Amina smiled, brushing back his hair. "No, baby. It's just the beginning." They passed a bookstore window where, among the latest political memoirs and novels, was a small display titled "Voices That Changed France." And there, among the faces, was a black and white photo of Elijah Baco, age 10. Notebook in hand, eyes full of fire, refusing to be forgotten.